June 1944, the coast of Normandy, in the days after the landings, and a German officer, observing the beachhead from a distance, is trying to understand how the enemy is supplying an entire invading army across an open beach, and then he sees something come out of the sea that does not make sense. A truck, an ordinary-looking military truck loaded with cargo, but it is not coming off a landing craft onto the sand. It is coming out of the water, swimming, moving through the waves under its own power like a boat, then reaching the shallows, then the sand, and then, without stopping, without being unloaded, without any transfer, simply driving up the beach and onto the road beyond, still carrying its cargo, a truck that was a boat a moment ago and is now just a truck again, motoring inland with its load. If you were that German officer, this was more than a curiosity. It struck at the very heart of a strategic assumption on which a great deal of German planning rested. And to understand why the swimming truck unsettled him, you have to understand that assumption. The German defense of the coast was built on a simple, sound, universally accepted principle that a modern army cannot be supplied across an open beach. An army is a bottomless consumer of supplies. The fuel, the ammunition, the food, the endless tonnage we have discussed throughout this series. And moving that tonnage from ships to shore was believed to require a port. A real harbor, with docks and cranes and deep water, where cargo ships could tie up and be unloaded directly. Without a port, the reasoning went, an invading army might get ashore, but it could not be sustained, because you could not push enough supplies across a beach to feed it. The waves, the tides, the lack of docks, the sheer difficulty of moving heavy cargo from ship to shore without proper facilities. All of this meant that an open beach was, for logistical purposes, a dead end. And this assumption shaped everything. It meant the Germans could concentrate their heaviest defenses on the ports, certain the enemy would have to capture one quickly or wither. It meant that the invasion, wherever it came, would be a race for a harbor, and the Germans had fortified the harbors into fortresses. The whole German strategic picture rested on the conviction that the enemy needed a port, and needed it fast, because without one, the invasion would starve. And the swimming truck was a small, visible piece of the evidence that this entire assumption was wrong, that the Americans had found ways to supply an army across an open beach without a port in defiance of everything conventional logistics said was possible. The conclusion available to the German officer, watching that truck climb out of the sea, was a slow and sinking realization. If the enemy could move supplies directly from ship to shore, across an open beach, then the whole German bet on the ports was undermined. The invasion did not need to capture a harbor immediately. It could sustain itself over the beaches, supplied by trucks that swam, and by other methods the Germans were only beginning to grasp, buying the time to build up an unstoppable force ashore before any major port was even taken. This is not a story about trucks. This is a forensic audit of one of the greatest logistical achievements in the history of warfare, the supplying of an invading army across open beaches, without a port, and of the humble swimming truck that was one of its most ingenious and important tools, and of how it, and the larger system it belonged to, shattered a German assumption on which the entire coastal defense had been built. Part 1. The German Calculus. We have to begin by taking the German assumption seriously, because it was not foolish. It was, in fact, the accepted wisdom of military logistics, shared by essentially everyone, including Allied planners, and it was based on solid reasoning. Supplying an army is, as this entire channel has emphasized, a problem of moving colossal tonnage. A modern army in combat consumes supplies at a staggering rate, and all of that tonnage, in an invasion from the sea, has to come from ships and get onto the shore and then move inland. And moving heavy cargo from a ship to the land is genuinely difficult without proper facilities. In a port, it is straightforward in principle. The ship ties up at a dock in calm, deep water. Cranes lift the cargo directly from the hold onto the dock, or onto trucks and rail cars waiting on the dock. The whole operation is stable, mechanized, efficient. A good port can handle enormous tonnage quickly, which is exactly what an army needs. Across an open beach, everything is against you. The water is shallow, so large cargo ships cannot come close to shore. They must anchor offshore, and their cargo must be transferred to smaller craft to reach the beach. The sea is rarely calm. Waves and surf make the transfer difficult and dangerous. The tides rise and fall, changing the shoreline and stranding or swamping craft. There are no cranes, no docks, no mechanized handling. Cargo must be manhandled, or driven, across soft sand that bogs down vehicles. And every ton must make an awkward, vulnerable, inefficient journey from ship to smaller craft to beach to inland transport, with transfers at each stage that slow everything down. The conventional conclusion from all this was ironclad. You cannot supply a large army across an open beach for any length of time. You can land an initial assault force, yes, and supply it roughly for a short period. But to sustain the vast ongoing tonnage a growing army requires, you need a port, and you need it soon. This was not a German prejudice. It was the shared assumption of military logistics worldwide. And the Germans built their entire coastal defense on it, quite rationally. If the enemy needs a port, then defend the ports above all. Fortify them into fortresses, make their capture enormously costly, and ensure that if a port is about to be captured, it is demolished so thoroughly that it will be useless to the enemy for a long time. The German strategy was, in effect, to deny the enemy the ports and thereby deny him the ability to sustain an invasion. A sound strategy, given the assumption that the enemy could not manage without a harbor. So the Germans concentrated on the ports, confident that this was the enemy's critical vulnerability. And they were, in this confidence, walking into one of the great surprises of the war, because the Allies had looked at exactly the same problem, the impossibility of supplying an army over open beaches, and had refused to accept it as a permanent limit, and had set about engineering their way around it with a combination of ingenuity and industrial abundance that the Germans did not anticipate. That is the German calculus, a sound, universally shared assumption that a large army could not be supplied across an open beach without a port. A rational coastal defense strategy built entirely on that assumption, concentrating on the ports and preparing to deny them to the enemy. And a fatal failure to anticipate that the enemy would simply engineer a way to do the thing everyone agreed was impossible, supply an invading army over the open beaches, buying the time to win before a port was ever needed. Now let us look at how the Americans and their allies made an open beach into a port. Part 2. The American answer. The Allied solution to the port problem was not one thing. It was a whole system of ingenious solutions layered together, and the swimming truck was one of the most elegant pieces of it. But to understand the swimming truck, you have to see the whole approach, because it is a magnificent example of the American and Allied way of attacking an impossible problem from many directions at once. The fundamental insight was this: if you cannot bring the army to a port, bring a port, and port-like capabilities, to the army. Do not accept the beach as it is. Transform it, with engineering and machinery and sheer abundance, into something that can function like a port, at least well enough, for long enough, to sustain the invasion until the real ports could be captured and repaired. Start with the swimming truck itself, because it is our subject and it is a small marvel. It was called the DUKW, from a manufacturer's code that the soldiers turned into the affectionate nickname Duck, and it was an amphibious truck, a standard military truck design adapted with a watertight hull and a propeller, so that it could drive into the water, swim under its own power through the surf, and then drive back out onto land, all without stopping. Think about what this solved. The great problem of the open beach was the transfer. Cargo had to move from ship to landing craft to beach to truck, with slow, vulnerable transfers at each stage. The DUKW collapsed those transfers into one. It could be loaded with cargo directly from a supply ship anchored offshore, then swim to shore through the surf, then drive up the beach and inland, delivering its cargo directly to a supply dump well beyond the sand, all in a single continuous journey, with no transfer at the waterline at all. The cargo went from ship's hold to inland dump in one vehicle, eliminating the most difficult and vulnerable step in the whole beach supply process. This was enormously valuable. The DUKW could carry cargo, and it could carry the wounded back the other way. It could operate in conditions that would defeat other methods. It bridged the ship-to-shore gap in a single amphibious hop, and the Americans built these swimming trucks in large numbers and used them in enormous quantity, and they became one of the workhorses of amphibious supply, not just in Normandy but across every beach the Americans assaulted, in Europe and in the Pacific. The humble duck, swimming ashore with its load, was one of the key tools that made beach supply possible at scale. But the DUKW was only one piece, and to appreciate the full audacity of the solution, you have to see the largest piece, which is one of the most astonishing engineering feats of the entire war. The Allies built artificial harbors, entire prefabricated ports, in England, towed them across the English Channel in sections, and assembled them off the Normandy beaches. These were called the Mulberry harbors, and they were staggering in conception. Enormous concrete structures, breakwaters, floating roadways, and pierheads that rose and fell with the tide. A complete artificial harbor, manufactured in pieces, floated across the sea, and erected on an open coast where no harbor existed. The Allies, unable to capture a port quickly, simply brought their own ports with them, prefabricated, across the channel, and built them on the beaches. Consider the sheer conceptual boldness of that. Faced with the problem that they needed a port and did not have one, the Allies did not merely find ways to struggle across the beaches. They manufactured harbors, actual working harbors, as prefabricated kit, and installed them on the enemy coast. It is one of the purest expressions in the entire war of the American and Allied approach to problems. If the thing you need does not exist where you need it, then build it, in your industrial heartland, and ship it to where it is needed, at whatever scale is required. They did it with the fuel, and the food, and the blood, and now, most audaciously of all, with the harbors themselves. And around these central solutions was a whole array of other methods. Beaching ships designed to run right up onto the sand and unload directly, specialized landing craft of many kinds, underwater fuel pipelines, and a vast organization dedicated to moving supplies across the beaches by every means that ingenuity could devise. The whole thing together, the swimming trucks, the artificial harbors, the beaching ships, the pipelines, the specialized craft, constituted a complete system for doing the thing everyone had agreed was impossible, supplying a great army across open beaches, in enormous tonnage, for as long as it took. The Germans had bet that the enemy needed a port. The Allies brought their own port, sent trucks swimming through the surf, and supplied an entire army across beaches that conventional wisdom said could not sustain it. Part 3. The River of Steel. The beach supply achievement is one of the supreme logistical feats of the war, and it connects directly to every theme this channel has developed, because it is the same story of ingenuity and abundance applied to an impossible problem. Consider first that it is, at bottom, the same logistics story we have told throughout the series, in its most extreme form. The whole point of the beach supply system was to move colossal tonnage from ships to shore to inland, the same tonnage of fuel and ammunition and food we have discussed all along, now being moved across the uniquely difficult barrier of an open beach. The swimming trucks and the artificial harbors existed to serve the River of Steel, to keep it flowing even where there was no port to receive it. They are one more chapter in the vast American logistical achievement, applied to the hardest delivery problem of all. Consider, too, that it is the same pattern of refusing to accept a limit. Just as the Americans refused to accept the range of a fighter as fixed, and refused to accept disease as an unavoidable cost of war, and refused to accept the scarcity of rubber, so they refused to accept that an army could not be supplied across a beach. In every case, the pattern is identical. A limit that everyone treats as permanent, attacked with ingenuity and industrial power until it yields. The Germans treated no port, no supply as a law of nature, and built their defense on it. The Americans and their allies treated it as a problem to be engineered away, and engineered it away. Consider the industrial abundance required, building fleets of amphibious trucks, manufacturing entire prefabricated harbors, producing the specialized landing craft and beaching ships and pipelines in the quantities needed. All of this required an industrial capacity of staggering scale, the same bottomless productive capacity that produced everything else in this series. Only an industrial base of enormous power could manufacture harbors as prefabricated kit and swimming trucks by the thousand. The beach supply system was, like everything else, built on American and Allied industrial abundance. And there was one more piece of ingenuity that deserves mention, because it solved the single most critical supply problem of all: fuel. An army of tanks and trucks drinks fuel in the enormous quantities we examined at the very start of this series, and getting that fuel ashore over a beach was one of the hardest parts of the whole problem. The Allies solved it with an audacity equal to the Harbour's. They laid fuel pipelines across the floor of the English Channel, running the fuel directly from England, under the sea, to the beachhead, so that the lifeblood of the mechanized army flowed to the front through pipes on the seabed. It is one more example of the same relentless pattern, a problem that seemed to demand a port, solved instead by a piece of engineering audacity that simply went around the problem entirely. If the fuel could not come through a harbor, it would come through a pipe on the bottom of the sea. And consider the sheer tonnage the whole system moved. Across the Normandy beaches, in the weeks and months after the landings, the Allies landed men, vehicles, and supplies in quantities that beggar belief. Hundreds of thousands of men, tens of thousands of vehicles, and millions of tons of supplies poured across open beaches and through the artificial harbors, in a flow that grew relentlessly until the force ashore was overwhelming. This was the thing conventional wisdom had said was impossible, happening on a colossal scale, day after day, across sand that was supposed to be a logistical dead end. The swimming trucks were a small but vital part of moving that ocean of tonnage, and the ocean of tonnage was what won the campaign. And consider the connection to the deepest strategic level. The German bet on the ports was a reasonable bet, and if it had been correct, the invasion might have been in serious trouble, forced into a desperate early battle for a fortified harbor. The beach supply system took that bet off the table. It meant the Allies did not have to capture a major port immediately. They could land where the Germans were weaker, away from the fortified ports, and sustain themselves over the beaches while they built up their strength, precisely because they had brought the port capability with them. The swimming trucks and the artificial harbors did not just solve a supply problem, they unlocked a strategic freedom. The freedom to invade where the enemy was not, rather than where the ports were. And that freedom was one of the keys to the success of the whole invasion. The Germans defended the harbors and waited for an enemy who, they were certain, would have to come and take one. And the enemy landed on open beaches the Germans had judged less critical, and supplied himself across them with swimming trucks and manufactured harbors, and built up an unstoppable force, while the fortified ports sat waiting for an attack that came, in its own time, only after the outcome was already decided. Part 4. The German Realization. The German realization about beach supply was, like so many in this series, a dawning horror as an assumption they had trusted, completely revealed itself to be false. In the days and weeks after the landings, the Germans watched the Allied buildup across the beaches and slowly grasped what was happening. The enemy was not withering for lack of a port. The enemy was growing stronger every day, pouring men and supplies across the open beaches at a rate that should not have been possible, sustaining and expanding a beachhead that, by the logic the Germans had trusted, should have been starving for want of a harbor. The swimming trucks, the strange structures appearing off the beaches, the sheer relentless flow of supplies over sand that was supposed to be a logistical dead end. All of it added up to the collapse of the assumption on which the coastal defense had been built. And they could not respond adequately, for reasons that were partly the familiar material ones, and partly the deeper problem of having been strategically surprised. Their heaviest coastal defenses were concentrated on the ports, which the enemy was calmly declining to attack. Their strategic reserve had been positioned, and their planning oriented around the expectation of a fight for a harbor. And now the enemy was building an army on open beaches, and the German dispositions were, in a sense, aimed at the wrong problem. The fortified ports, so carefully prepared, were largely irrelevant to an enemy who had brought his own harbors. And the deeper German realization was the one this channel arrives at from every direction. They had been beaten not by a secret weapon they could not have imagined. The concepts of amphibious trucks and artificial harbors were not beyond German understanding, but by an enemy who could take those concepts and realize them at a scale, and with an industrial abundance and an organizational sophistication, that Germany could not match. The Germans could have conceived of a swimming truck or an artificial harbor. They could not have built the fleets of swimming trucks and the prefabricated harbors and the whole vast beach supply system, because that required the industrial capacity and the abundance that only the Allies, and above all the Americans, possessed. And they had made the deeper error too, the error of treating a limit as permanent. They had accepted no port, no supply as a fixed law, and built everything on it, and been undone when the enemy refused to accept the same limit and engineered his way past it. It is the same error we have seen again and again, the assumption that because something had always been true, it always would be. The failure to imagine that an enemy with sufficient ingenuity and industrial power could dissolve a constraint that seemed absolute. The German officer who watched a truck climb out of the sea and drive up the beach was watching, in miniature, the collapse of the assumption on which his entire coastal defense had rested. The enemy did not need his ports. The enemy had brought the sea's edge under his own control, with swimming trucks and floating harbors and an abundance of ingenuity and steel, and there was nothing in the German playbook that had prepared for an enemy who could simply manufacture the one thing everyone agreed he would have to capture. If your father, your grandfather, or your uncle drove a DUKW through the surf, or served in the engineer and quartermaster units that ran the beaches and built the artificial harbors and moved the endless tonnage across the sand, I would be grateful to hear his name and his unit in the comments. The beach supply achievement was one of the greatest logistical feats in the history of war, and the men who accomplished it, driving swimming trucks, assembling harbors, working the beaches under fire, are almost never remembered, because logistics wins no glory even when it wins the war. They are mostly gone now. What remains are the stories their families carry. Those stories belong in the record. Part 5. The Verdict. 1944. The invasion succeeds, the beachhead holds and grows, the army ashore becomes unstoppable, and one of the deepest reasons is that it was supplied, against all conventional wisdom, across open beaches, by a system of ingenuity and abundance that the Germans had not believed possible. So here is the verdict. The Germans built their entire coastal defense on a sound and universally accepted assumption that a great army could not be supplied across an open beach without a port, and that the enemy would therefore have to capture a harbor quickly or wither. They fortified the ports, prepared to deny them to the enemy, and waited for the battle they were sure would come. The Allies, and above all the Americans, refused to accept that assumption as a permanent limit. They attacked it with a whole system of ingenious solutions, swimming trucks that collapsed the ship-to-shore transfer into a single amphibious hop, prefabricated harbors manufactured in England and towed across the sea, beaching ships and pipelines and specialized craft, and they supplied a great army across open beaches, in defiance of everything conventional logistics said was possible, buying the time to build an unstoppable force before any major port was ever taken. The German officer who watched an American truck swim out of the sea and drive up the beach, and felt the ground shift beneath his strategic assumptions, was making the last version of the error his army made about everything American. He had trusted a limit as a law of nature. He had not imagined that the enemy would simply engineer the limit away, with ingenuity and steel and an industrial abundance that could manufacture the very harbors he was certain the enemy would have to capture. The Germans fortified every harbor, certain the enemy would need one. The Americans brought their own harbors with them, sent their trucks swimming through the surf, and unloaded an entire army onto an open beach. And by the time the Germans understood that the assumption had failed, the force ashore was already too strong to stop. The Germans could not imagine supplying an army without a port. The Americans could not imagine accepting a limit they had the ingenuity and the industry to destroy, and so they built swimming trucks and floating harbors, and did the impossible thing, and won the lodgment that won the campaign, that won the war in the West. If this forensic audit gave you something to think about, hit the like button. It keeps this channel visible to the people who want the history the way it actually happened. Subscribe if you want the next audit, because there are more of these, more systems, more decisions, more of the invisible, unglamorous machinery that decided who won and who came home. And remember this about the swimming truck. Nobody makes a film about a DUKW, a homely, boxy truck with a boat's hull and a propeller, chugging through the surf with a load of ammunition, then climbing out of the sea and motoring up the beach as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was not a weapon. It was not glamorous. It was a truck that could swim, and it looked faintly ridiculous. And it was one of the small, ingenious, unsung tools that made the impossible possible. But that swimming truck, and the thousands like it, and the manufactured harbors, and the whole vast system of beach supply, did something that everyone, including the enemy, had agreed could not be done. They supplied an army across an open beach, and in doing so they dissolved the one assumption on which the enemy's entire defense had rested, and they helped open the door to the liberation of a continent. Mostly, when the army on the beach needed supplies, they came, across the surf, in the holds of trucks that could swim, and through harbors that had been built in another country and floated across the sea. They deserve to be remembered. The DUKW drivers, the beach engineers, the men who built harbors on an enemy shore, by the quiet, astonishing truth that the Americans and their allies won the greatest invasion in history, in part with a truck that could swim, and that sometimes the thing that changes the world is not a wonder weapon, but a homely, ingenious solution to an impossible problem, built in abundance by a nation that refused to believe the impossible was permanent.